Hey there, listeners. It's Shane.
And Ishan, your hosts from the Total Party Thrill podcast, the newest addition to the Don't Split the Podcast network.
We talk topics that help you, dear listener, create and play better RPG games.
We have a back catalog of more than 150 weekly episodes.
And we got nominated for an Emmy for episode 11, Social Contracts.
In episode 154, we talked about crossing the moral event horizon. How evil is too evil?
We also recap our home games, like the 40k Rogue Trader campaign, Dynasty Unwarranted.
But that's mainly just you trying to kill us all. In your defense, our characters are greedy idiots.
Don't forget the 3 years we spent in Eberron playing Morning Glory, your 5th edition D&D campaign.
We also review new RPGs and books, and every episode we build a 5th edition D&D character in the Character Creation Forge.
You might check out the Pint-Sized Punisher from episode 119, a halfling with a bad attitude, and 14 levels of Barbarian.
So to recap, Total Party Thrill, RPG advice, campaign recaps, and D&D characters built by your dashing hosts every single week.
What more could you possibly want?
To get back to the actual show?
Oh yeah, let me just hit this button, and here you go.
This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. On the show, I've got Brandon Dixon of Swordsfall and the Welcome to Tikor Kickstarter that recently blew up like gangbusters. Tikor is a campaign setting where Brandon is setting an original role-playing game. We get into the mechanics, we get into Tikor a little bit, we get into how he finds his amazing artists. We only scratch the surface of the amazing setting that is Tikor, of Brandon's process and his sort of genius methods of working, so we're definitely going to have him back. But for now, here is my interview with him. All right, everybody, now I am here with a great game designer, great creator, storyteller. I'm really, really excited about this. Brandon Dixon, welcome to Tabletop Babble. For people who don't know, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games and also comics and all kinds of media I see your name going to be attached to now or in the future?
Yeah, so I am the creator and writer of Swordsfall. It's an Afropunk sci-fantasy setting. I think it's one of those things where when I first came out, I mentioned RPG, so everyone just thought it was just RPG, but it's really a setting. So, obviously we're doing graphic novel, which I just successfully kickstarted last month. And then we have the art and setting book, Welcome to Tikor. And I'm a writer with like a budding, wanting to be a novelist, so I have basically like a mini setting book on Amazon, and I have like some longer works I'm working on. So basically, think of it like a universe, and I'm going to hit up different mediums to sort of bring like a vision of an Afropunk world and, a bunch of different stuff.
I first found out about you from your Kickstarter. And I want to get into that. I want to talk about Tikor. I want to talk about all the things that you're going to be doing, especially related to tabletop role-playing games. But first, take me all the way back. When did you first play a tabletop role-playing game, and what did you play? And were you running the game? Were you a player in the game? Just sort of set the scene for me.
So I cut my teeth on Vampire the Masquerade. I knew of tabletop and I heard D&D and it just wasn't really my jam. And then I think I was just having a conversation with someone and they brought it up and I was like, I'm not really into D&D. And they're like, oh, no, we play Vampire the Masquerade. And, this was before it felt like vampires were the flavor of the month. There wasn't a ton of vampire stuff. So I was like, oh, I'm intrigued. Then, you see, and it was the classic green and black one with the rose. And I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. You read through it. And I'm like, oh, it's kind of gritty, but it's not overly just, gore porn for no reason. It had a purpose and a vibe. And I really dug that. And that's one of those game experiences that I think stuck with me out of any other tabletop I've played since. It's just because it did a really good job of mixing story in with the world, And that was just what clicked for me. I feel like if I had started off with the more stat-based, it wouldn't have clicked with me the same way. But the interacting as part of the story and being a character in it, and not always in a mechanical sense. One of the things I go back and forth with people is about the classic, lore versus like lore at the table, you know? And for me, my first experiences were we were in the world of darkness, but we very much wove our own stories. You know, like we were our own main characters, but also kind of side characters to like a bigger story. And that was something that was just always very intriguing. It was very fun, you know, and it's kind of an experience that I feel like is unique to tabletop gaming. I feel like you don't really get that same that same vibe that you're into something like that, you know, and it always stuck with me. Like even going back, like playing. I mean, I DM'd some vampire games. I played other games after that. I eventually played D&D and Pathfinder and all that good stuff. But when I sit down to write a campaign, it's very much from that tasty lore and plot sort of realm that I started off with.
It's no surprise, right? Tikor is filled with lore, and anytime I read something you put out, I feel like I have a zillion ideas for a story that you could tell in that setting, right? And it has that richness that I do think Vampire the Masquerade and a lot of the other White Wolf games have, right? Like there's a story here, there's a mood here. Right, it's not just sort of a generic fantasy sandbox. And again, nothing wrong with D&D if that's what people want to sink their teeth into. But there's like it's going for something. It's trying to say something. It's trying to tell a particular kind of story. And I get that impression that you're doing that with Tikor as well. Where did your idea for Swordsfall come from? The idea of the world, right? Because it's bigger than a role-playing game. Like you said, it is this setting. Where did the idea for that come from?
Swordsfall is in a way like a 2.0 of like an original story. Way back in high school, me and a couple of guys decided we were going to make a video game, right? And one guy was going to program, the other guy was going to do like art and promotion, and I was going to do the story. And me as a person, my general attitude is that once I say I'm going to do something, I do it. Like my mind is made up and I'm already ready. Like my mind's spinning. Like I can't wait to get it out. So I just went ham. You know, I sat down and ran out like a 45 page like world summary, and I had like ideas and all this other stuff. And the game never got programmed.
Oh no!
No art ever got made. But I had this 40-page story doc that I spent, months on and poured my soul into. And I don't want to say it was soul crushing because it wasn't soul crushing. It was kind of like, well, maybe like it'll happen someday. Maybe I'll do it myself. And over the years, as I got into tabletop, it just became a really easy place to like plunder for information, because the original idea, I was always like a kid that was into philosophy just because it was interesting to me how the mind can see different things in different ways, even the role of people. And my idea was like, it would be interesting in my head is like, what if you had a world where the landmass was evenly split, but they were only connected by a little tiny piece of land, because like one of the, not to get too nerdy, but one of the interesting theories about like the growth of the Americas is the isolation it has from natural border enemies, right? It's just that natural thing. Like when you are safe, you can just make whatever you want because it doesn't matter, So I wanted to have a world that had that same feeling, but at the same time, you're not all the way isolated. There still is an actual strip of land that does make it to where it can cross over. Not as likely as if you have a full border, but something there. And I just wanted to play with the concept, and I kind of had like it was like, what if the top half was, polytheistic and the bottom half is monotheistic? And I just kind of thought about some imagery, and it was like a phoenix versus a dragon. And it was just a very concept stuff. And I just kind of spun it off of that. And that's basically how I made the original story, which was called Ethereal at the time. And over the course of, 10 years, I would kind of pull from this world, and I would take a character name and I would throw it in a game. And then I would take like a game character that I had in a tabletop and I'd throw it back into the world. And I would basically just do this sort of back and forth. And last year I had this moment where I just kind of really wanted to do something. I had this urge to create. And in my brain, it was like, I think it's time to just connect all your stuff together. Like you kind of already have a world that would make for a cool tabletop campaign. And then once I actually started putting all the little pieces together, this little weird nation I made for this tabletop game and this character I made for this tabletop game, once I put it all together, it clicked. I was like, oh, I have like a whole world here. Oh, I can actually do something with this. And so it was like accidental, but not accidental, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I let the world grow organically in my mind over time. And it was more like I was writing the chronicles of this world rather than deciding what happened.
It's so clear that this has been in your brain for a long time, right? There's so much detail to everything that comes out. It's like, wow, this is well thought out. This is somebody really thought about this. Somebody did a lot of research about this. And you not only do research into the world you're creating, you also do a lot of research into like the people you're working with seem very talented, but also two, like perfectly suited for the things that you are asking them to do and the partnerships you're creating with them. You have some incredible artists working with you. I mean, no lie, this is some of the best art that I have ever seen. I think everybody wants to find like the artist who is amazing, who nobody else knows about, right? How are you able to find people that you want to work with?
Couple different things, man. Like for one, it helps that I've been like a lifelong nerd.
Mm-hmm.
And and like nerdy in like a non-tribal sense, you know, like I had a Nintendo as a kid, I had a PlayStation, I had an Xbox, I had a PC. Like if it was cool, I played it. If it was cool, I watched it. Like I was watching anime before I knew it was anime. I just know it looked hella cool, so I was watching it, you know? So I never particularly had like a niche that I only liked. I just liked stuff that was cool. So I already had like an aesthetic that I liked because I wouldn't necessarily let one thing get me out of the way. And I feel like sometimes when people are looking for artists, they have a specific style already in mind that's based off their preferences. And I mainly looked for like there's a little bit of style, but mainly in terms of like, you know, like when you look at a graphic novel or a comic book, and there's a page that has like a sense of completeness, not necessarily in the number of colors. There's just a feeling of like completeness. And it's a weird feeling that I think you can only really get once you've just been around the media enough. And when you're on the internet, and basically I went to Pinterest, man, because I worked in a World Anvil at the time, and I knew that I wanted to add pictures on World Anvil to help people visualize the world I was conceptioning. And this was before I kickstarted Welcome to Tikor, so I didn't have any money. I didn't have an artist or anything. So in my mind, I was like, well, I don't want to rip off anybody's art. So I'm just going to look at Pinterest and find like small art from people who are just doing it for cool projects, give them full credit. That way it's no biggie. And then when I get to a point, maybe a Patreon, maybe I can buy, you know, get some real art. So you start looking around on Pinterest and you start looking at art and you find, for one, and I think we talked about this on my Twitch stream, Pinterest is massively underrated.
Yeah.
So if you want pictures and you're not using Pinterest, you are doing yourself a disservice, for one. Two, Swordsfall has a great Pinterest folder on there with a ton of art. So, and the nice thing about Pinterest is the engine does a really good job, just like Google, of trying to make things relevant. So if you find a piece of art that you like that has like a vibe, because that's what I look for. There's like a vibe I look for. Like I feel like because art's so personal, artists put themselves into it. So when you find a good piece of art, it's not just about like a style and like a technical way. Like you get a feel for what they like to do, what kind of color palette is like their favorite. You know what I mean? There's like you figure out a lot about an artist in their piece. Like you don't have to be technical like art school. You just, you know, it's like a flow to it, you know? Like same thing with writing. Like there's a reason we pick the stuff we do. And you don't have to be big to have that. And like sometimes some people's best pieces are the piece they did at Thursday night at midnight for some random stupid sketch. And they put it on DeviantArt and they're never going to share it because they didn't think whatever. But like you get a feel for like who they are. So that's what I was trying to do. I was just trying to find like cool art that felt like it had a vibe to it. Just like music. Like music has the same thing. Like you feel like you can get like a vibe for where someone was in their head when they made a song. Same thing with art. So I'm trying to find people who have like a feeling of experimentation, people who were not just copying something they saw in a comic book, but trying to come up something from their heart, from their head. And me being a writer, my hope at the time was that, cool, I got all the words for whatever. So if I can find someone who just needs some inspiration and some guidance, I can give that to them. And then they can make this cool piece in my world. And that's how I found Tumo. I was just going through and looking for any art piece with Black people in it. And he had this really awesome Black Panther fan sketch where he had Killmonger and T'Challa side by side in like a half face piece. And the way that it was sketchy and the angles, I was like, that's the dude. Like, but if you look at him, he hadn't been in any major projects or anything like that. And like his art was everywhere in terms of like quality, which a lot of people misjudge artists by that. And I think that's just something that happens if you just hang around with artists. You realize there's a difference between their speed sketch and their obsessed over it for 3-week sketch. But, I just, look at that and this guy, he's got something. He's got something he wants to work toward. And I think maybe because I also had the mentality at the time where I was super hungry. But if you look at my portfolio, I don't have anything major. But I had that hunger of like, just give me a shot, coach, And there's so many artists like that. And I think if you focus more on trying to find people who have that give me a shot coach energy rather than like they made a super crazy AAA piece that you would want to see in a D&D book, you find good art because they want that shot. And there's this weird crossover between writers and authors, between writers and artists. But there's also this gap, right? Because you have writers that draw, you have artists that write, but you rarely find anyone who's like super A+ at both. There's just like a time crunch, I think, like there's a serious amount of time you had to put into doing art, serious amount of time doing the writing, only so much time in the day. But you can find artists who, if they had all the time in the world, they'd write books, but they don't. So as a writer, you get to be the one who provide the material. So I go out of my way to try to give them concepts rather than details. So I don't say, hey, I want them to be X feet tall and lanky and thin and this color hair, because that kind of constrains the artist, and that doesn't necessarily lead to a bad piece, but you're not getting the artist, you're just getting like the mechanics of it, and you'll get a mechanical piece. So instead I do this a lot with Tumo, I just give him concepts. Like for the Killer Crew or like Nubaya, I just was like, hey, I have this idea for a pirate. She's basically the king of the pirates, and she kind of has a swagger, but she's not cold mean. She's that I get done cold, but and and you can kind of get an image in your head, and I don't have to tell you the details, but you can kind of see it. And we just kind of talk about stuff like that. And then so he'll write out some sketches, and he'll usually do like maybe 4 or 5 different ones of different styles. And then I look at them, and I still have that idea in my head, and I look at them, and sometimes I'll be like, oh, straight up A or straight up B. Or sometimes I'll look at it and say, like in the case of Nubaya, that was a mixture of 6 different panels. I was like, I like the boots on this one. I like the jacket on that one. I like the smirk on that one. And I like the head on that one, And it sounds greedy, but to an artist, they're like, cool, because I figured out that's kind of how they draw anyway. So he's like, cool, that's easy. And because I didn't tell him exactly how I wanted to mix it, he gets to mix it in the way that flows. And then he comes back and he goes, what do you think about this concept? And I either go, awesome, ship it, or I go, maybe tweak this or that, but I still keep it concepts. Like, I think when Nubaya, the first time it came back, I was like, I want her to have more of a smirk. Like, that smirk you give someone when you got them, and the smirk that people hate to see because they know you got them. I was like, I want her to have that smirk. And then he came back, and now it's like a trademark of the character because it gives a feel for that in that, what I mean? And I feel like that's been the secret to the art, is I just keep it conceptual, which artists seem to really like because that's how they work. But I give them enough information to where they don't really have to be stuck on anything except for the parts that they don't like, which means they spend more of their time tweaking the parts that they don't like, which means I get a super awesome piece instead of them having to waste 10 hours on, is it a guy, is it a girl, how tall are they? Like, I can give them that feedback, and then they can just be creative, you know?
I do think you're happier that way and your artist is happier. If you're focusing on things like mood and feeling and what you want the art to evoke, right? Rather than their hand is turned up at the elbow and they're carrying this and this is exactly what their clothes like. Like that's like, that's horrible for you because that's more work for you. And it's also horrible for the artist because they're not getting to really express themselves. And one of the best things is getting a piece of art and being like, holy crap, this has surprised me in ways that I didn't think were possible, right? Like, that's like, oh, you blew my mind. And that's even better than what I was picturing, you know?
And people should tell their artists that. Like, I'm the kind of person that if I like something, oh, you're gonna know it. I can't help myself. I'm like, like if someone was to ever to hack into my base camp, they'd be like, this guy is a fanboy because they'll post art and I'm like, oh my god, I love this. Heart. My feedback is this is amazing. Keep doing this. I don't know, awesome. Like, so I tell them when I like it because I feel like you should tell people when you like it. And to me, that's natural. But then I hear back from artists all the time that people don't often tell them when they like a piece. And I'm like, but how though? Like, if you are giving someone money for an art piece and you like it, you should tell them. Like, there's a weird, and maybe I get this as a writer because you don't really know if your stuff is good until it's already done. Like, it's so vulnerable because there's no feedback in the middle because you can only grade it when it's done. And that's something I've also have to work with my artists because I've noticed a lot of them have, I don't want to say PTSD, but it almost feels like PTSD where they don't want to show their stuff in concept because they're worried that it'll give the wrong tone or I'll critique something that's not finished. And you can tell that they have that because people have done it in the past. So I've had to work a lot, be like, no, I'm just curious where you're going with it because I'm a nerd and a fanboy and I just want to know. Like, I won't say a word. I just want to know. And it takes time, but over time now, like they're getting more comfortable. Be like, hey, work on this. I'm like, awesome, cool. And you just had to work with an artist and realize that their creativity comes from their passion, and passion is so weird. Sometimes it's Tuesday and passion is asleep, and that's just it. So you don't need to add anything to it. You want to help stoke that, like what you need, like. How you doing? Where you been? Like, stuff like that. Like, check up on your artist. Like, sometimes I'll message him and be like, hey, buddy, I haven't heard you in a week. How's it going? Blah, blah, blah. Like, just to shoot the crap, just to make them feel at ease so that they don't have to worry about stuff. At least not as much on my side. I'm a happy client. Like, if I have any issues, we'll talk about it. No worries. Go play art. Like, because that's how it should be, in my opinion. It should be a fun process. Like, I'm not there to crack a whip. Like, we already know it's a transaction. We don't have to really focus on that part. Like, let's make it fun and collaborative. And one thing I'll say for sure is I know I get not free art because I pay for it, but I know people have put in extra hours over what their invoice normally should because they enjoyed the piece. Right. And when I see that, A, I tip, and B, as everybody knows, I shout the crap out of my artist because I feel like that's a missing component. Like, it's amazing how many artists aren't known for stuff that's even famous. Yeah. Like, I'm glad I checked to see who comments on my Twitter because I'll get comments, like not bad comments, the comments, well, that's cool. And I click it and I'm like, oh, you're an artist. Cool. What'd you work on? Oh, you were in Wizards of the Coast. I've never heard of your name in my life. Oh, this was on page 2. What? Like, there's a lot of that. And so me, like, not that I'm big or anything, but I'm like, I want you to know my artist because you're looking at their art. It's awesome. I didn't draw this. Let's not pretend. Like, like there's a weird thing where it's like, obviously you didn't draw the art, bro. Like, it's okay to shout them out. I'm like, no, I didn't do the arts. Like, Sabina did this piece. Tumo did this piece. Venus did this piece. They're awesome. Go follow them. Give them money so that I can afford to buy them more art later on. Like, it's a cycle. But it's something basic that a lot of people forget.
Totally. Yeah. And it is so important. Those shout outs really do help people now in the age of social media and everything find work, sharing work, talking about who did it, that kind of thing is so, so, so important. Hey, everybody. I just wanted to let you know that this episode of Tabletop Babble is brought to you by Kobold Press and the Kobold Guides. You want to learn how to game master, world build, run combat, design games, and more from the pros? Well, check out the multiple winning Kobold Guides over at koboldpress.com. Each guide covers a broad topic and includes advice from multiple industry pros. I'm talking Keith Baker, Shauna Germain, Monica Valentinelli, Wolfgang Bauer, Margaret Weiss, Rob Schwalb, and so many more. Many were guests on this program or will be in the future. Spoilers. There's a Kobold guide for almost every topic: magic, plots and campaigns, even board game design. Each tome is chock full of valuable advice for newcomers and veteran gamers alike. Find out more at koboldpress.com and pick up a book that's right for you. Let's get back to the babble. I want to delve into the role-playing game mechanics a little bit of Swordsfall, at least what we can talk about. I know, the book is coming. It's not out. So we'll talk a little bit about what you have published on the Swordsfall blog, which is really great. You start with this idea that, like, hey, it's sort of inspired by the Genesis system, which people may know as the Star Wars system that then became a generic system that has these weird storytelling dice that allow you to do a lot of really cool things, right? Succeed with advantage, fail but with a triumph, all that kind of stuff. But you need to have these weird dice. And the first thing I saw is you have a sort of similar system, but I get to use regular dice with numbers on it. So right there, I was already in, because one of the most frustrating things is figuring out all of the dice after you roll them when you're playing Genesis. It's like, okay, so these cancel this out, but this doesn't cancel this, and this yada yada. Like in this, it sounds like I'm adding numbers, which makes me very happy.
In a way. So it's like one of those catch-22s. It's like the best part of Genesis, and it's also the hardest, and some people think it's the worst, is the dice. Now, for me, my problem initially was looking at the dice. I could not figure what was going on from the pictures. Like the way they have like the threat and success, I get they're trying to be stylistic, but it confuses the hell out of me. So I literally had to make myself a cheat sheet when I first got into Genesis, because I was like, it's going to take me forever to remember what this pip is on this dice side. Crazy town. So obviously, for one, it's proprietary, so you can't use it. But anyway, I knew I was not going to use those symbols. That's not to say maybe I won't have proprietary dice, but if I do, they'll be so much easier to read, because that's just a pet peeve of mine. But in essence, what it's really trying to do is it takes the standard integers that like we all kind of know that like on say like a D10, traditionally 1 is your worst, 10 is your best, and there's some, medium in the middle. So instead of just trying to break away from that just because, I lean into that, but then I try to lean into that to get you to think about more. So, for instance, like in Genesis, the D8 is pretty much one of your most common dice. Like that's your standard stat, Since I'm not using the custom dice, what I did is I had sort of rearranged the order so that if you look at the table, like the 1 is pretty much your fail, not because it gives you a failure, but because you get nothing. And that's kind of how it works with you basically have like a positive dice pool, negative dice pool. Your positive dice pools, your character, it's based off of your stat, your skill, equipments, whatever. And your negative dice pool is basically the environment. You'll have your difficulty dice, which is set by the difficulty, whatever action is going to be. And then you have 2 other dice that get added in case of extra stuff. So if you're trying to do something extra difficult, you might add in the extra D12 to add in extra shenanigans. And then there's like another D6, which is your complication. Since it's only 6, it's sort of you're trying to jump into a car, but you're going at high speed, right? Instead of necessarily changing the difficulty, because getting into a car is getting into a car, you add a complication dice. That way you get more of a thematic interesting. There's more disadvantages rather than just straight failure. And that's a little bit on the GM side. And one of the things I want to do in the RPG book is not necessarily over-explain it, but I want to give GMs different ideas of why you might use one versus the other, because they are interchangeable, and it's supposed to be. And that's kind of the fun of it. Instead of it being straight difficulty equals this, there's a little bit of like leeway. Like, all right, we'll just make this more complicated, which is thematically interesting. And if you're the player, you're like, no, please no. You're like, yeah, complicated.
I love that. One, it's fun to see like, okay, now, why don't you pick up that dice now and add that to your dice pool or that kind of thing. But there's also binary dice results allow for sort of binary storytelling. You either do the thing or you don't, right? And maybe there's like a special critical hit option, and maybe there's like an uber fail option, but most of the time it's succeed or not. And what I love about Genesis and what I love about your system is you're mixing in those complications. Can you sort of give me an example of like how it might work in Swordsfall if you're rolling the dice to, I don't know, make an attack or jump across a pit or negotiate with someone, that kind of thing?
We'll use the classic hacking example because it works so well. So let's say you are going to hack into a safe, right? You would decide what character stat you want to use, which in Swordsfall and much like Genesis, there's 6 stats. And it's pretty straightforward. 2 body, 2 mind, 2 soul. And it's to sort of show that they're similar, like you have your agility versus your vigor, that sort of thing. So you basically figure out which stat you want to be appropriate to it. Because one thing I want to do is I don't want to necessarily say if it's hacking, then you have to have the hacking skill, because that's not how it works. Like really, you're just saying, I want to get into the safe. Some people might take a sledgehammer. Some people might take the more delicate route. And if you don't necessarily say what it has to be, you just have to have your character justify what they're doing, right? So in the case of hacking, let's say you are a computer guy and you did get the computer skill because you want to do stuff, right? Well, that's a logic. So you would get your logic stat and then your computer stat. And how it works in this is pretty straightforward. You pick of those two, which one has the highest ranks. You're usually going to have higher skill than stat because it's a low weight game. And because stats is using everything, they don't move very much. 2 is like average for a human. 5 would be your max. Most people are going to sit between 3 and 4 for the majority of it because it's not meant to be that kind of game, because the subtlety comes out in how you use it. So let's say you have 2 logic, 3 computer, which for like an average player is pretty average. That's your average pool is going to be about that. It's just going to depend on which stat, which skill, and other environmental stuff. But 2, 3, right? You pick whichever one is your highest one, which in this case is computer. So it's going to be the talent dice, which is your D8. And that's why I said the D8 is your most common one. You're pretty much always going to have a D8 in your pool. So you have 3 D8s because you have 3 ranks in computer. So what'd you do with the stat? So the lower one upgrades your initial 3 dice. So you still have 3 dice, but 2 of those get bumped up to a D12. Because that's basically you're saying that, hey, I'm logical and I have computer skills. So the 2 of those combined make it stronger, because the game does allow you just to roll with 1 stat. And that's on purpose. You are meant to always be able to attempt to do anything. You just might not do it well or succeed. You might succeed with a crap ton of disadvantages, and I want it to be that sort of thing. Instead of it thinking, oh, I don't have swimming on here, I can't do anything. It's like, oh, okay, what can I use it with? This is more of a mind thing. I only have 2 mind and nothing else. Do I want to risk it? Well, I want to feel that more of a tactical rather than just you're locked out of it, right? So 2, 3. So now you have 2d12 and your d8. That's it. That's your basic roll. Anything else is going to be anything extra you pick up from your profession, anything extra. That's why that D6, that luck dice, is kind of nice, but it's kind of extra. That really shows the going out of your way to get extra dice in your pool, because you're not naturally going to, right? So the whole point is to be low dice so that you're not spending your time gathering dice. I want people to spend more of their time thinking, how can I get myself in a situation or out of a situation,
Right. Exactly. It's so cool because there's this idea of sort of approaches, right, to what's going on. Like, hey, you are picking how you get to swim across this thing. So if you want to try to use mind instead of body, that's available to you. I love that.
And it's just one of those things I want people to not necessarily justify, but every table is different. Some table completely embraces doing things in an absurd way. Like some tables are like, no, we're logical. And I don't want to say who's right and who's wrong. I'm just giving you the tools and then not necessarily pushing off on the table, but I'm saying it's up to y'all. I'll give you a default. So if you want to say the book says, but I'm also going to be like, override me if it's more fun. I don't care. I'm not there. You do you. But I do want people to break out of a feeling they can only do one thing and one thing only, right? So you're hacking the safe. You got your 3 dice, right? So now the GM gets to decide how difficult is this, right? Normally and there'll be a table. There'll be like a suggested difficulty. 2 is pretty much a number keep in your head. 2 is pretty much average on just about anything because it's 5 is your average for pretty much everything. 5 stats, 5 is your max on just about everything. 2 is your average for just about everything. So 2, 5. Let's say it's not a crazy safe, and then GM's like, nah, normal difficulty, 2. So that means you add 2 difficulty dice. So now you're adding 2d8 because that's the difficulty. If that's it, right? So you only have 5 dice, right? The D12 on the negative side only comes in when you're doing something exceptionally bad. Rather than the DM telling you no, I'd rather the DM be like, cool, it's going to be a D12. We all know situations where you're pushing the line. You're like, what if I do this? Instead of the GM being like, no, just pick up that D12. Be like, all right, that's a disaster dice. That sort of thing. And then complications is when that's when the GM decides, like, if there's environmental things, like let's say it's broad daylight. Instead of maybe cranking up the difficulty because it's broad daylight, you might add in a complication, a D6, and say, well, it's broad daylight and a D6. So those are the things that are going to outweigh your positive dice. And that's why I say it's a balancing game, right? Because if you have dice to spare, maybe you're willing to take on a difficulty task. If you're not, maybe you only have 2 dice for a roll. Do you want to take the risk of maybe it being 2 difficulty and a disaster and 2 complications? Look over at your teammates and be like, who's going to back me up? That sort of thing, right? So now that you have your dice pool, you roll it. And this is the reason why Genesis decided to do proprietary dice. Because since it's not just about straight pass or fail, the different digits on the dice actually tell you what happens. So on that D8, that talent dice, your main D8, right? 1 is the only roll on that dice that does nothing. That's your nothing. If you roll a 1, nothing good happens. You didn't get a success. That's just a wasted dice, right? Everything else on that positive D8 has something good, but it scales up in how good it is. If you roll a 2 or a 3, it's a success. Nothing extra, you just succeed. 4, you get an advantage. No success, but an advantage. And an advantage, if you're familiar with Genesis, is where you get to do other stuff. That's where you say, well, an advantage on hacking a safe might be you hack the safe, assuming there's success. You hack the safe, and there's also a passport in there. There's also gold, and depending on how many advantages you get, it might ramp up, but it depends on how you roll. So 4 is an advantage. 5 and 6 is a success with an advantage. And so that's important because in this game, how it rolls is you have to have a success. If you just have an advantage but no successes, you didn't successfully do the task, but you get an advantage. But that means the advantage cannot be tied to being successful, right? So you couldn't say the advantage was getting to the safe because the roll was about getting to the safe. If you fail it, but you get an advantage, it might be that you don't get into the safe, but on the side of the safe, you see who made it. Now you know how easy to get into it next time. Something like that. If there's that's the and part. But you have to have at least one success to actually succeed the roll, even if you get advantages, right? So 5 and 6 is success with advantage. And then 7 and 8, because that's your top of the dice, those are your 2 good stuff. So 7 is 2 successes and 8 is 2 advantages. And so that's how it works literally every time. And that's why they have those pictures on the side, so you can easily just tally up. You could easily see, okay, success, 2 advantages, blah, 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 blah. And on the bad dice, it's the same thing, but different. It's either a nothing, a failure, a disadvantage, and then like multiple fails and disadvantages. And a failure equals out to success. So if you roll 1 failure on your negative dice and 1 success on your positive dice, you have nothing. So that part is similar. Not the same thing with disadvantages though, because advantages and disadvantages do not discount each other. You get both. So let's say in this roll, you roll it, you get enough successes to be successful, but you get an advantage and a disadvantage. So that means you hack into the safe, you find a cool passport that you can use, but the disadvantage is it trips a hidden alarm. And so as you get more advantages or disadvantages, that can change the roll. 3 advantages might be you crack open the safe, it's got money, it's got some jewels. It could be you find the dossier to someone you can use as a contact. You can be creative, but the more advantages you get, the better it should be. Same thing with disadvantages. Or you can multiply it. The GM could be like, cool, you got 3 disadvantages, so 3 crappy things happen. So there's room for interpretation, there's room for play. I'm also going to have like a list of suggested advantages and disadvantages in case no one's feeling creative, because Lord knows that happens. But I want people to feel free to invent stuff. And one of the other things as well is on the professions themselves. Each profession has its own special advantage sheet, right? And this is because I'm an anime fighting game nerd and I'm a big fan of ultimate moves. So I wanted to have some sort of, you roll enough advantages and some cool stuff happens. So I have like 1-star, 2-star, like 3-star special moves that are in your profession. So if you roll 3 advantages, you can do something super, super cool related specifically to your profession. Or you can do whatever. So it's just that kind of stuff. I'm always trying to make a default, but not so locked in it feels you have to, but it kind of gives you a theme to go off of, gives you a flavor to go off of, and then you guys can make up your own stuff if you want to. But that's kind of the system. I mean, that's really, everything else is an extension of that. It's just an extension of moves that take away disadvantages, moves that add advantages, moves that give other people disadvantages, like that kind of stuff. And you're just trying to play around with success, advantages, stuff like that.
So, right, so that you can tell a great story and, hey, if you get the disadvantages, well, too bad. And if you don't, then you get to make yourself more awesome. I love that. I love that so much. It sounds like you could, and I've seen you talk about this online, put out a custom dice set for this system if you wanted to. If you do, please make the symbols very clear.
They will be super clear. Like, I was sitting there thinking about that. Like, they would be super, super clear because, it's one of the things I completely understand why people have a hard time with Star Wars, And but yeah, it's a fun system, man. Because I'm a big fan of both storytelling and crunchy play. Because Vampire's my favorite game, but I also love Shadowrun, so I'm that guy. So I have a love for both, and I hate how it feels like there's a gulf in between, and I'm not going to say I'm Shadowrun crunchy, and I'm not going to say I'm like storytelling line and say Dungeon World, but like I'm finding my happy middle that I like. In a weird way, it kind of plays like a fighting game, and, in the way that this is like my own weird game design philosophy, but I have a big love of what a fighting game tries to maintain. A feeling of you can do anything, but also your character is really good at one thing, but not so good as to be bad, And it's a weird line to cross. And when a fighting game finds that balance, like say Street Fighter 4, it blows up. People love it. Like it becomes something more than itself. And I feel like not that tabletop games have to be like video games in the weird way video games are trying to be like tabletop games. It's like a weird looking across like the fence because it's like I feel like every other video game I'm like, are you rolling random stats in the background? These RPG mechanics look familiar. So there's already some crossover, but I'm trying to think about a game in a way where I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I gave you a goal, and then I give you the tools, and then I make each one themed so that it feels like you're doing something different, but you're not. Because that's a fighting game. Like at the end of the day, you're hitting X and Y until the other person dies. But the way you present it is what makes it feel different.
Yeah, and it's, if the story, right, if the outcome of your action or the way you perform the action, I guess we should say, is different, then that in a role-playing game, that does matter. That is different because the story is different. And if you know your mechanic, then great, because you can do anything, right? Once you understand a role-playing game's core mechanic, players become infinitely more comfortable with trying to figure out what they can and can't do because they can play around in the system. They can test the limits and that kind of thing. And it sounds like you've got something very flexible that is going to let players have a lot of fun in it. I'd love to real quick just talk about professions a little bit in Swordsfall. The professions that you have in the game are numerous, and professions are kind of like, to make the D&D analogy, just because we know that's what a lot of people play, classes. But they seem broader than that, I guess, and with a chance to get even more specific within each one. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah. It's another one of those design concepts. Instead of thinking as a class as a predefined kit or like a thing you do, I really thought of a profession more as a career. Like, what do you do in life? Like, instead of a classic warrior, I think a profession like a doctor. Like, you know what to expect when you hear doctor. Sure, there's different kind of doctors, but when you say medical doctor, you're like, oh, you don't have to be trained as a medical doctor, but you know what a medical doctor entails. There's an X amount of schooling. You know that if I have X thing, I can probably go to them. And that's what I focused on more than thinking about classical fantasy tropes or mechanics. I literally thought, okay, what are people going to do? What happens if this happens? And who would be there to help them? Because that's really, when you think about it, that's how we get our professions, Like, what is a warrior besides a dude with a sword? Like, well, usually a warrior is someone with purpose. Like, it's a guard or it's a hunter, and a warrior is more of a catch-all. And rather than doing a catch-all, I decided to actually make them thematic. And I talked about this a little bit on Twitter. I don't have the intention of making the professions seem balanced, because they're not meant to be balanced by mechanic. They're meant to be balanced by theme. You don't go to a doctor because they lift weights. You go to a doctor because it feels like you're dying and you know that they can help with that. When you need to build a house, you don't go to the doctor, and that doesn't make a doctor any less important. It just means in that situation, the doctor is not as important. However, if someone gets hurt at the work site, guess what? Doctor's still important again. And it's that sort of thing. And so I thought about it more like that. And when I thought of like that, it really took away any sense of, well, if you have too many classes, then they have to be balanced. And it's like, well, if you're balancing off of mechanics and you're only making a difference between, well, this guy has a two-handed sword, then yeah, you have to balance it. But I don't do that. I mean, your celestial shield could use a two-handed sword if you want to. I mean, that's just not what they're known for, but that doesn't mean you can't. It's the same way. Like, you can break expectations. You just have to deal with the fact that society's gonna be like, oh, I didn't realize y'all did that, because that's what we do in real life, and I try to do more that thematically. Like, my goal is for someone to open up the profession book, read through them, and go, well, this sucks. I want to play all of them.
Yes.
Because they all sound cool, and not because you look at a skill and go, that sounds OP. Like, I want someone to read and go, well, that just sounds cool as hell. And by making sure that the dice system itself isn't off the rails, it makes it a little easy to balance. Because like I said, it's really about how you're using your advantages and your disadvantages. So take a physical class, for instance, because this usually what I've found happens a lot in tabletop games is melee finds themselves in the weird spot. Like, you either are god mode with a sword in close combat, or you're just getting pieced up because the game bounces on mechanics rather than theme. So rather than say that X class is melee or X class is range, which I do, mainly so that people can know thematically, because some people just love to attack from afar. Some people love to attack with a sword. That's just the thing, right? But I look at it as a profession. I'm like, okay, if you are a celestial shield and you know for a fact that you are a frontline, a spear, and shield type people who guard people, at some point you know you're going to deal with range. How are you going to deal with that? You know? And I don't necessarily have to go out of my way to make it seem like you can go toe to toe. I just have to make it seem like as a profession somewhere, someone over 1,000 years decided that, hey, maybe we should deal with this bow and arrow situation, you know, and then there's a talent or two that makes it feel thematically like you can deal with it. Does that mean you can go toe to toe with an archer? I don't know. How lucky are your dice? You know, it's still a tabletop game. And so I want it to feel more like that, but I wanted to feel like you have tools so that you're just not standing in the wind. Because I think for me, one of the experiences that not necessarily killed D&D for me the most, but it was definitely a situation where I was like, this is why this will never be my favorite game, is I was playing a paladin and everyone warned me beforehand, but I was like, I get it. But thematically, I have a character that I want to play as a paladin, and it doesn't make sense to not play a class because it's not fun. Why can't we make it more fun? You know, and it was one of those things. And I remember having this moment where all I could do was just swing because I had no smite left. And I was just like, this sucks. All I can do is wait with my predetermined stat pool and add or remove some stuff as the bard stuff goes off and on. I was like, I hate this. I was like, there has to be a more fun way to do stuff like this, because your first instinct shouldn't be like, well, you should cry class with this to get this move. And it's very mechanical. And it's not very, what's a paladin? Like, is any defender of a guy going to stand there and just wail with a sword and stand there in place? You know what I mean? It's just stuff like that. I'm like, can't that call in Paylor for help? No, like I pray to you every day, bro. Like, I'm just saying, you know, like, so I want it to feel more like an interactive, where like, yeah, I've even thought about, and this is no guarantee, but I've even thought about stuff like clutch mechanics, where like, let's say you have a garbage roll and everything misaligns against you, and you get like 4 disadvantages and like 3 fails, you know, like the kind of roll where you're just like, you want to pack them and go home. I almost thought about having to where like, if you hit X, you know, tier level of techniques and stuff like that, because I don't do a lot with levels. Maybe you have a move that you can spend that's available once per game, where you get to call to your DT or your homie or someone. You know, like I want to feel like, I always wanted to feel like there's always maybe a tool to help you with, you know? So I don't know. I just want it to feel thematic. I want it to feel fun. I want you to be excited by the time your turn comes around. I want you to be prepared, because there's nothing worse than your turn comes around and you're like, wait, what to roll again? Who am I? What stats are going on? Like, I want it to be more intuitive, because I want you to be looking at what other people are doing and be like, oh. And one thing that happens in my game a lot as well is, because like I said, fighting game, when you think about it, is I want people to combo off of each other. I want the feel of, you are a group. A group does work together. And I feel like it's a weird thing we forget as humans. You can get a group of people together, and if there's a situation it needs to be, humans have a weird way of like working together. Like, we fall in line, you know? Like, one of the things I have is like the Mabar class is kind of like, I nickname it my Black Zangief, because it's like wrestling, and it has like this sort of like battle cries that they can like incite the crowd and like feedback off on it. And I always imagine a situation where Mabar's fighting and he suplexes someone, and then he rolls his little battle inspire, and people are like, yeah. And the Jalen has this move where when someone rolls against them and they get X amount of disadvantages, their next move they get like is basically the equivalent of being dissed on, like, oh, look at that, you missed them, and then they get like a status effect. So I wanted to like to roll off of each other, like you're looking to see what your other teammates are doing, because you're like, oh, I got a perfect move for this, you know. And I want it to feel like that collaborative, fun storytelling, like seeing someone's disadvantages and be like, oh, I got a move for that, you know, like that kind of thing, you know, like rather than dice.
That is awesome. I am really, really excited for this. We're out of time, but I need to have you back. We need to continue this conversation, because this is incredible, Brandon. So, but before we go, let people know, where can they find you?
Man, I'm everywhere. So you can find me online. The website is www.swordsfall.com. You can find me on Twitter at Swordsfall1. I'm on Facebook, Facebook RPG. I'll also be at a whole bunch of cons this year.
Yes.
I'll be at PAX West, which I think I'll be at probably by the time this comes out. I'll be at Big Bad Con in October. I'll be at PAX Unlimited in December. And I can officially talk about it now. I'll be at MozFest in the end of October in London.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yes, enjoy. That's going to be great. Well, I am looking forward to having you back on here. I'm looking forward to playing Swordsfall. I'm looking forward to exploring Tikor. I think it's going to be great. Thank you so much for joining me today on Tabletop Babble. Wow, what a great conversation with Brandon. That was awesome. I've been wanting to have him on the show for a while now. Great to finally have him. We got to get him back. So much more we didn't talk about. You know, people, Tabletop Babble needs your support, and you can do it with your dollars or by leaving us an iTunes rating. If you want to leave us dollars, head on over to patreon.com/Introcaso, where if you give as little as $1 a month, you can vote on the direction this show is taking, upcoming topics we're going to talk about, things like that. And you can also, at higher levels, get more content. So go check that out. Videos, articles from me, stuff like that. But if you don't have the dollars, or if you already give to the Patreon, and I love you so much if that is the case, but you haven't left us a 5-star review on iTunes, please go do that. It helps other people find the show. Even if you're not using iTunes to listen to podcasts, odds are your podcatcher algorithms uses iTunes to rate and recommend podcasts to others. And if you leave us a 5-star review, I will read it out loud and credit the person who left it. You can make me say anything you want, like Kathness, who is from Canada. Kathness says, as a DM and the writer of a new game, this podcast helped me see how professionals are doing it, makes me tackle writing the campaign in a better way and a better DM in general. I don't have to pretend that everyone knows everything, even if they are a seasoned player. For someone who wants to start playing or wants to start DMing, this will give you the confidence that you can. Well, thank you so much, Kathness. I really, really appreciate this review, and I hope you're having fun over there in Canada, running your games, making games. It sounds like a blast. You can find me on Twitter at James Introcaso. That's at JamesIntrocaso. Or you can check out my blog, World Builder Blog, which is all about the game design stuff I'm doing. Go check that out as well. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Don't forget, RPGs are like sex. Hey everybody, I just wanted to let you know the podcast you just